People ask me how it ended. I've learned to be careful with that word ended, because the thing I'm describing didn't end so much as exhaust itself. A fire ends, a war ends. What happened to the Varath cartel over the 6 years following the Corvith session was more like a slow structural failure, a weight-bearing element removed from the middle of a building that looks for some time exactly the same and then does not. I was 44 years old when I sat in the gallery of the Grand Convocation Hall on Verth Prime and watched Ambassador Edith Voss stand up from the wrong seat, smooth the front of her coat with one hand, and walk out of the most powerful trade chamber in the known systems without saying a word. I am 61 now. In the intervening years, I have been a deputy at HFY, a senior counselor, diplomatic archivist, and for the last 4 years a lecturer at the Interplanetary Studies Institute on Callaway Station, where young people with good intentions and insufficient experience come to learn how political bodies work. I tell them, read your documents. I tell them, understand what you are holding before you put it on the table. I tell them the most dangerous seat in any chamber is the one you force someone to sit in. They write it down. They don't know yet what it costs to learn it. I'm going to tell this the way I remember it, which means I am going to tell it slowly and without the benefit of hindsight's tidying. I was not at that stage a senior figure. I was a third-tier counselor attached to the Earth Diplomatic Compacts Trade Bureau, present on Verth Prime as a note-taker and document handler, one of 11 support staff supporting a 5-person principal delegation. I was in the architecture of that room furniture, but I had eyes and I had the professional habit of watching the things that the principals were too busy performing to notice. That habit is why I can tell you what I'm about to tell you, and what I'm about to tell you is not the story that ran in the galactic press, which was breathless and wrong about almost everything, including the number of people in the room and the direction Ambassador Voss was facing when she stood. Let me start with the room itself, because the room is part of what happened. The Grand Convocation Hall on Varath Prime was built during the cartel's second expansion period, when the Varath oligarchs still believed that visible grandeur was the most efficient form of intimidation available. They were correct about this in many cases. The hall was an architectural achievement in the specific sense that it achieved its intended effect on nearly everyone who entered it. You felt small. The floor was a single continuous slab of pale amber stone quarried from the Varath highlands and polished until it reflected the ceiling, which was a vaulted arrangement of overlapping arches trimmed in hammered copper, and the whole interior was lit by recess channels along the arch spines that produced a warm amber gold wash over everything, every surface, every face, every delegation. It was a light that made the Varath look burnished and authoritative, and made everyone else look like visitors in someone else's house, which was of course the point. The Varath themselves were a tall species, narrow-shouldered, with a slight forward inclination to the neck and jaw that most other species read in informal settings as an expression of sustained attention. In formal settings, in the hall at the table, draped in the bronze and amber robes that cartel protocol mandated for full convocation, this posture read differently. It read as looking down. I do not know whether they understood that This was how they appeared to shorter species, and I do not know whether it would have changed anything if they had. The Verath's political culture had evolved over several centuries of commercial dominance around a single organizing principle. Position is earned through demonstrated dependency, not demonstrated capability. The distinction matters. A party could be extraordinarily capable and still be treated as marginal if its absence from the cartel's commercial ecosystem could be absorbed without disruption. The question the Verath asked about every entity at their table was not what can you do, but what happens if you leave. For entities with shallow roots in cartel commerce, new entrants, small partners, parties whose commercial footprint was mostly external to cartel space, the answer was not much, and so those entities sat where the Verath put them, in galleries, in courtesy chairs, in observer tiers with 12-minute address windows and no deliberation standing. It was not cruelty. It was in the Vera's own framework. Accurate, they were measuring the weight of your absence, and if the weight was negligible, they seated you accordingly. The error they had made across 11 years of dealing with the Earth Compact was that they had continued measuring the same variable they had measured in year 1. They had watched Earth's corridor freight volume grow and attract it as a figure in their shipping revenue models. They had noted the bilateral commercial relationships expanding and had logged them as individual line items in their compliance reviews. They had, in other words, observed the growth of the lattice from inside it without ever stepping back far enough to see its shape. The Verath were meticulous accountants of individual facts and poor architects of aggregate pictures. This was, I later came to understand, a known characteristic of their analytical culture. Their compliance offices were structured to evaluate relationships one at a time, not in aggregate, and it was a characteristic that Ambassador Voss had understood and worked with for 9 years. The seating arrangement was equally deliberate. At the center of the hall sat the convocation table, a single, enormous ovoid of the same amber stone, seating 32, 16 to a side, and around the table at fixed stations sat the recognized member bodies of the cartel, the 14 founding oligarch houses, the 6 affiliate trade blocks, the 4 chartered shipping consortia, and the 8 observer status planetary governments. These were the participants. These were the bodies whose voices counted when the cartel's standing committees made decisions that rippled out across 60-odd star systems and touched the commercial lives of something approaching 11 billion people, most of whom would never set foot within 10 light years of Verath Prime and had no meaningful say in what those decisions were. The gallery was a different thing entirely. The gallery ran along 3 walls of the hall above the level of the convocation table, a curved tier of seating with a clear sight line down into the chamber, and the gallery was for observers, petitioners, and non-credentialed parties who had been granted presence but not participation. It was comfortable seating, as galleries go. The sightlines were good. The acoustics were designed to carry the chamber's deliberations upward clearly. The Verath architects had understood that a gallery's purpose was to let the people inside it hear and see everything happening at the table. They were not permitted to join and to feel with every passing minute the precise weight of that exclusion. The Earth Diplomatic Compact had been a recognized observer at the cartel. Convocation for 11 years at the time of the Corvith session, 11 years in the gallery. In year 4 the compact had applied for provisional membership. The cartel's admission committee had declined to advance the application, citing an incomplete harmonization of Earth's internal trade frameworks with cartel standards, a procedural objection that was technically accurate and substantively irrelevant since the frameworks in question governed categories of commerce that Earth did not actually engage in with cartel member bodies. The objection was a shelf. The application sat on the shelf for 7 years. In year 8 the compact had applied again on an expedited basis, citing the expansion of Earth's commercial presence in 4 cartel adjacent systems and a significant uptick in bilateral volume with 3 of the chartered shipping consortia. The admission committee had again declined to advance it, this time citing the need for a full membership impact assessment, a process that the committee's own charter set at 18 to 36 months, and the matter had been tabled pending that assessment, which was still ongoing at the time of the Corvith session. What the compact had during those 11 years was a chair in the gallery, a right of formal address to the chamber for a maximum of 12 minutes per session, and the standing to submit written positions to any open docket, which positions the cartel's working committees were under no obligation to acknowledge. What the compact had built during those 11 years was something the cartel's analysts had assessed repeatedly and never correctly understood. I'll come back to what that was. The Corv session was named for the system in which it was primarily concerned. Cluster of commercial routing agreements governing transit through the Corv corridor, a set of jump point approaches that had become over the previous decade the single most trafficked arterial lane in the inner systems. The cartel's founding shipping consortia held the corridor licenses. 3 of those consortia were in a rate dispute with 4 of the affiliate trade blocks, and the session had been called to adjudicate the dispute and issue binding cartel guidance. This was on its face an internal cartel matter. The Earth Compact's commercial vessels had been using Corvith corridor approaches under provisional transit permits for 6 years and now carried something like 18% of the corridor's total freight volume. An internal cartel decision about corridor governance would therefore materially affect Earth's commercial operations. This was why we were there. This was, I should say, the explanation we gave. Explanation we gave was accurate as far as it went. It simply did not go very far. We arrived on Verth Prime 4 days before the session opened. Ambassador Voss had been Earth's senior trade diplomat for 9 years by then, and she had the manner of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything an alien political body did, which was not the same as being unbothered by it. It was more that she had developed the professional discipline to process whatever she encountered and continue functioning without visible disruption. She was a compact woman, mid-50s, with close-cut gray hair and a stillness about her that I had initially mistaken. When I first joined the Bureau for coldness, it was not coldness, it was a specific kind of patience that is only available to people who have been waiting a very long time for something they are entirely certain is coming. I had worked in her bureau for 3 years by the time of the Corvith session, and in those 3 years I had watched her Conduct somewhere in the range of 60. Bilateral meetings, 4 multilateral. Sessions, 2 treaty reviews and 1 full cartel working committee hearing in which the Earth Compact's written position had been acknowledged in the opening minutes and not referenced. Again, I had watched her absorb slights. Routine, procedural, deliberate, with no visible response. I had watched her accept outcomes that were unfavorable, note them in her working file, and move on. I had watched other members of the Bureau, newer ones, interpret this pattern as resignation or compromise, or the accumulated accommodation of a career diplomat who had learned to work within the limits of what was achievable. I had not at that point understood it correctly either, but I had begun to notice that the limits of what was achievable had over 3 years shifted very slightly in ways that were only visible when you went back and compared the current conditions to the conditions that had existed at the start. The shifts were too small to celebrate and too consistent to be accidental. There was one moment in my second year with the Bureau that I have thought about in connection with the Corvette session many times since we were at a joint trade review on Raven Station, the same Raven shipping consortium that would later be a primary party in the Corvette dispute, and a Raven commercial director named Orvith San had made a point of addressing the Earth Compact submissions last in a session where the order of address was not formally prescribed and had done so with a particular smoothness that made it clear the order was deliberate, and the deliberateness was a message Voss had waited. She had given her submission. She had thanked S for the review. Afterward, in the transit back to our ship, I had asked her, because I was 2 years in and still learning the grammar, "Does it bother you, the order thing?" She had looked at me for a moment. She said, "Everything that happens in a room like that is information. The question is whether you're collecting it or reacting to it." I had written it in my notes. I had not at the time understood the full weight of it. In the 4 days before the session, she met with the heads of 2 chartered shipping consortia in private and with the lead representatives of 2 affiliate blocks and with the cartel's own session coordinator, a Verath official named Keth Orville, who was professionally courteous and gave nothing away. I attended these meetings as a note-taker. In none of them did Ambassador Voss make any demands or raise any objections or signal any concern. She asked questions, she listened, she thanked people for their time. She was, by every visible metric, a cordial observer preparing to observe. On the evening before the session opened, she gathered the 5 principals herself: Deputy Ambassador Ruiz, Senior Counselor Preach, Commercial Attaché de Merez, and Legal Advisor Ak, and the 11 of us support staff in the suite at the Verath diplomatic residence. She stood at the window outside the city of Verth. Prime's capital gleamed in that same amber light that the hall deployed so effectively. An entire civilization doing its version of what the hall's architecture did, telling you where you stood. She said, "They will do something tomorrow. I don't know exactly what. I know they are going to do something to remind us of the shape of the arrangement. When they do, you will follow my lead exactly. Whatever I do, you do the same. Is that clear?" It was clear. She said, "The document packages you have each been issued contain a green tabbed folder. Do not open it in the hall. Do not reference it in the hall. When I leave tomorrow, you leave With me, you leave the green tabbed folder on your seat. That was the entirety of her briefing. I have in 17 years of diplomatic work, since that evening, attended approximately 600 procession briefings. That one was the shortest. It was also, in retrospect, the most complete. The session opened at the 9th hour by Verath local reckoning, which put it at approximately mid-morning in terms of biological alertness. A deliberate choice, since the Verath were a species that reached peak cognitive performance in their own mid-morning cycle, and they had designed their official working hours accordingly, with no particular concern for whether any other species rhythms aligned. We had adjusted our sleep schedules for 3 days in advance. The Verath knew we did this. It was, I think, a small additional data point they had absorbed about us without especially registering its implications. We entered the Grand Convocation Hall from the Eastern Annex approach, which was the designated path for gallery level attendees. The route passed through a secondary corridor, then up a half flight of stairs and into the gallery tier from the rear. It was a functional route. It did not pass through the main floor of the hall, did not cross the amber stone of the convocation table's level, did not put gallery attendees in the same physical space as participating delegations. This had been the case for 11 years. What we found when we arrived was different. The gallery when we entered was empty, not minimally occupied, empty. Normally the gallery, during a major cartel session, held observers from non-member systems, commercial press, invited academics, and various petitionary bodies who had been cleared for attendance. The gallery accommodated perhaps 90 people on this morning. It contained, besides our delegation, 3 Verath officials in the amber-trimmed administrative uniforms of the cartel secretariat, positioned the back wall, and nobody else. The emptiness was itself a choice. Someone had arranged for the gallery to be cleared for this session. A gallery full of outside observers would have meant more witnesses to whatever was being staged. A cleared gallery meant the staging was for us alone. Ambassador Voss did not slow her pace. She walked to the gallery's front railing and looked down at the convocation table. I followed her gaze. At the table, the 32 recognized seats were occupied as expected. The 14 oligarch house representatives, the 6 affiliate blocks, the 4 shipping consortia, the 8 observer status governments, all present. The session's formal agenda was already displayed on the chamber's central holographic interface, a low, amber-lit projection over the center of the table listing the Korvath rate dispute as the primary docket item. There was one additional arrangement at the table that had not been present in any previous session I had attended. At the far end of the table, separated from the nearest recognized seat by a gap of perhaps half a meter, a gap that was itself an architectural statement, a visible remove, a carefully considered distance. A set of 5 chairs had been placed, not the amber stone and hammered copper chairs that the 32 recognized delegates occupied. Different chairs, lower-backed, plainer, in a pale composite material that read in that amber-lit room as something between utilitarian and deliberately underdressed. 5 chairs for 5 principals set at the table, but not of it, separated by a gap that every delegate in the chamber would see and understand. There was a placard. On the placard, in cartel formal script, were the words Earth Compact courtesy seating. I watched Ambassador Voss look at that placard for perhaps 3 seconds. She turned to the rest of us and said very quietly, "We'll go down." We went down the connecting stairwell to the main floor level and entered the hall from the floor level annex door. When we crossed the threshold onto the amber stone, there was a perceptible shift in the chamber's ambient noise. The low background of 32 delegates and their own support staff arranging themselves, consulting, conversing in the procession. Murmur, and that murmur subsided, not entirely but noticeably, the way room's noise changes when something enters it that the room was not expecting and is not certain how to receive. Ambassador Vass walked to the far end of the table. She stood behind one of the 5 courtesy chairs. She looked at it, then she looked up and looked at session coordinator Keth Orville, who was seated at the table's head position in the moderator's chair, and she looked at him with an expression that I would describe as entirely open. Not cold, not hostile, not questioning. She simply looked at him the way you look at something you want the other person to know you have seen. Orville met her gaze. He said in the cartel's formal trade lingua, "Ambassador Vass, the Earth Compact has been accorded courtesy seating at this session's table in recognition of its commercial interests in the core of the docket. We trust this arrangement reflects the compact standing appropriately." There is a phrase in the cartel's formal trade lingua. I have no adequate translation for it, but the closest rendering is something like reflects. You're standing appropriately, that is used when a senior party wants to communicate in fully deniable language that a junior party has been given exactly what they deserve and should be grateful for it. It was a phrase with a history. Most of the delegations in that room would have heard it used before. Most of them would have understood what Orville was communicating. Ambassador Voss said nothing in response to this. She pulled the chair out. She sat down. In it, she placed her hands on the table around her. Deputy Ambassador Ruiz and the other 3 principals took their seats in the 4 remaining courtesy chairs. I was in the gallery. I had followed the support staff up the connecting stairwell while the principals went to the floor. From where I sat, I could see the full sweep of the table, could see all 32 recognized delegates in their amberstone chairs, could see the 5 of them at the far end in those plain pale chairs, separated by that gap below the placard. And I could see, because I was high enough and at the right angle, the faces of perhaps a dozen of the nearest recognized delegates, the shipping consortia heads immediately to the table's interior, a block representative 2 seats further along, and what I saw on those faces when I stopped watching Ambassador Voss and started watching them instead was something I have thought about many times since. It was not triumph, I want to be precise about this. It was not the open satisfaction of a party that has just landed a blow and knows it. It was something more careful than that, something in the register of a person watching a procedure unfold and confirming internally that it is proceeding as expected, a quiet, contained confirmation, the kind of expression that belongs to someone who has planned something and is watching the first step execute correctly. I did not understand at that moment what I was seeing. I filed it away. The session opened formally. Orville called the docket. The Corv rate dispute was introduced, and the 2 lead parties, the Raven Shipping Consortium and the Meridian Trade Bloc began their opening presentations. These were detailed, technical, and long. The presentations covered transit, fee structures, corridor maintenance, allocation, force majeure provisions for jump point fluctuations, and a contested clause about rate adjustment triggers in the event of commercial volume changes greater than 20% in any 12-month period. Ambassador Voss listened. She did not consult documents. She did not whisper to her principals. She sat with her hands on the table still, and she listened to the presentations with the attention of a person who is hearing something important and wants to make sure she hears all of it. The first recess was called after approximately 90 minutes. The chamber cleared for 40 minutes by Varoth reckoning. In that time, delegations broke into their separate consultation clusters, the oligarch houses moving to one side of the anti-room, the blocks and consortia clustering differently, the observer status governments forming a loose, informal grouping near the refreshment stand. The Earth Compact principles gathered near a window. I brought water. That was part of my function. I handed glasses to the principals and stood near enough to hear. Ambassador Voss said to Ruiz in a tone that would not carry past a meter, the rate adjustment trigger clause. Did you catch the volume threshold? Ruiz said 20%, 12-month window. Voss said an Earth's corridor volume in the last 12 months. Ruiz said 18.4% of total corridor freight. Voss said growing. Ruiz said growing. Voss said they'll adjust the trigger before Earth crosses it. Ruiz said yes. Voss said all right. That was the whole conversation. When the session resumed, the presentations continued through the afternoon. The cartel's working procedure for rate disputes was sequential. First, the primary parties presented, then the affiliated parties presented, then the convocation moderator opened a structured response period, then the docket moved to deliberation for an observer status body. The procedure also included a right of address window, which was the 12-minute period the compact had been allocated. Ambassador Voss did not use it when Orville called the Earth Compact's address window. She said the compact passes on its address window at this time. There was a brief pause. Orville noted it in the record. The session moved forward. In the gallery I watched the faces again, the same shipping consortium heads who had shown that careful, contained expression in the morning showed it again now, but the one who caught my attention was not one of them. It was a figure I had not been tracking before, a Verth delegate I did not recognize, seated in the third chair along the oligarch house side, who had no obvious role in the Corvith dispute itself. He was watching Ambassador Voss with an expression that was different from the others, not contained, something closer to, and I have revised this assessment many times over the years, but I always come back to the same word: anticipation. The session ran until the evening by local time. At the end of the first day's sitting, Auroroville announced that deliberation would begin the following morning and that the convocation expected to issue binding guidance by the session's third day. Standard procedure for a rate dispute of this complexity. We returned to the diplomatic residence. The principals ate dinner together. I was not at the table. Support staff ate separately, but Diri's came out afterward for the coffee service and found me standing at the window looking out at the city, and he said in the manner of someone who has been carrying a question all day, did she know they were going to do the chair thing? I said I think she knew they were going to do something. Dear said that's not the same as knowing. I said no. He stood with his coffee. He said she didn't even look at the placard after the first moment. I said I noticed. He said, what does that mean? I said, I don't know yet. He went back inside. I stood at the window for a while longer, watching the amber glow of the capital city doing what it always did. And I thought about the expression on Voss's face when she sat in the courtesy chair, and I thought about the expression on the faces of the shipping consortium heads in the chamber, and I thought about how those two expressions were different from each other in a way I couldn't yet name. The second day of the session proceeded in the same pattern, opening presentations from the secondary affiliated parties, the two remaining shipping consortia, and the 4 remaining blocks all had positions on record about the Corvette dispute, since the rate decision would affect corridor-adjacent commerce for all of them. Then a structured response period, in which the primary parties answered each other's claims. The Earth Compact was again offered its address window. Ambassador Voss again passed. I watched the chamber more carefully on the second day. I had started by then to develop a theory about what I was watching, and I wanted to test it against the evidence of the room. The theory was this, that the courtesy chair arrangement had not been improvised, that it had been anticipated and planned for by someone on our side, that the particular quality of Ambassador Voss's stillness in that chair, the absence of reaction, the careful attention to the proceedings, the precise decision not to use the address window, was not a composed response to a surprise, but an execution of a plan. And if it was an execution of a plan, then the question I needed to ask was not what the plan was doing to the cartel. The question I needed to ask was what the plan had already done. Before we walked into the hall, the green tabbed folders were part of this picture, but I didn't know how yet. The third face I want to tell you about appeared on the second day. She was a member of the Elven Blocks delegation, seated along the affiliate side of the table, perhaps 8 chairs from Ambassador Voss's courtesy position at the far end. The Elven Block was one of the 4 affiliate blocks in dispute with the shipping consortia, which meant she was technically on the same side of the rate argument as Earth's commercial interests. Both parties wanted lower transit fees, but the Elven Block was also a long-standing cartel member with 14 years of full standing, and they had navigated cartel internal politics with considerable skill. And this delegate, whose name I later learned was Assessor Pyth, a title in her block system that roughly corresponded to Chief Counsel, watched the second day's proceedings with the expression of someone doing arithmetic. Pyth was a Calawan, a species with a pale gray complexion and wide-set eyes, adapted to the lower light spectrum of their home system star, which gave them, in the amber wash of the convocation hall, an appearance of permanent watchfulness. She was not old, not young, in that middle range of professional years. Accumulated experience starts to show, not in the face but in the economy of movement, the way certain practitioners stop wasting motion in rooms where motion carries meaning. She watched Voss, she watched Orville, she watched the shipping consortium heads. She was assembling something at the afternoon recess on the second day. I observed Assessor Pyth approached Ambassador Voss. In the anti-room, the approach was casual, incidental seeming. She was walking past and she stopped. They exchanged perhaps a minute of conversation. I was too far away to hear it. I watched Voss's face during the exchange. She was civil. She nodded. Once, when Pyth moved on, Voss turned and found Ruiz with her eyes and gave him a look I could not fully decode. Not a signal of alarm, not a signal of satisfaction, somewhere between the two. I have since, in conversations I won't detail here, come to understand what that conversation contained. Pyth asked, in the oblique professional language, that the cartel's culture had developed for exactly this kind of inquiry, whether the Earth Compact had a position it intended to state for the record, whether there was going to be a moment. Voss had said in the oblique professional language of someone who has been in rooms like this for 9 years that the Compact's position was entirely a matter of record and that the Compact looked forward to the convocation's deliberation. Pyth understood something from this that I did not understand until much later. The third day opened with deliberation. Cartel deliberation procedure assigned each full delegate a timed speaking window in which to state their position on the pending guidance, beginning with the primary parties and proceeding in descending order of cartel standing. This produced a predictable ordering. The oligarch houses first, then the senior affiliate blocks, then the junior blocks, then the shipping consortia, then the observer status governments, and last, since courtesy seating carried no deliberation standing, the courtesy seated parties were not called at all. This is standard. The deliberation ran through the morning. The oligarch houses, whose interests were distributed across both sides of the dispute in complex and partially contradictory ways, gave measured statements that largely split the difference. The senior affiliate bloc's positions were more pointed. By mid-morning it was clear that the cartel's guidance would favor a modified rate structure with the transit fees adjusted within a band that gave the shipping consortia most of what they wanted and the blocks a face-saving concession on the force majeure clause. This would incidentally affect Earth's corridor operations in a specific and calculable way. The adjusted fee structure would increase Earth's transit costs by approximately 12% on current volume, and the rate adjustment trigger clause, as Voss had predicted, was being set in the guidance at a 22% volume threshold, a figure that would remain above Earth's current share and could be adjusted upward again if Earth's share continued to grow. I was watching Ambassador Voss's face during the deliberation. She was listening, hands on the table. Still, when the session moderator Orville reached the observer status governments in the deliberation order, the 8 planetary governments seated at the table with recognized standing, he called each in turn. 3 of them had substantive positions, the other 5 gave brief formal statements of no objection. When all 8 had spoken, Orville moved to close the deliberation. He did not call the courtesy seated position. This was correct procedure. Courtesy seating carried no deliberation standing. He was not required to call it. He said the deliberation is closed. The convocation will now proceed to the guidance vote. Ambassador Voss stood up. She did not speak. She did not raise her hand. She did not signal for recognition. She stood up from the courtesy chair and she straightened her coat with one hand and she turned to her 4 principals and she gave the Smallest nod I have ever seen. Communicated across a professional space. And still be legible, they stood, all. 5 of them stood at the same moment. There was a pause in the chambers. Ambient sound, Orville said, Ambassador. Voss, the deliberation is closed. The guidance vote, she was already walking. Not quickly, not urgently, at the pace of someone who has decided that a room is finished and is leaving it. She walked the length of the table, past the 32 recognized delegates in there. Amberstone chairs, past the oligarch, House representatives and the affiliate, blocks and the shipping consortia and the observer status governments, past the holographic agenda display still, showing the core of docket, past assessor Pyth, who was watching her walk with an expression that was no longer doing arithmetic but had resolved into something settled and certain. She reached the floor-level annex door. The other 4 principals were a step behind her. She pushed the door open. She walked through it. The door closed. The chamber was silent for a full 3 seconds. I was counting in the gallery, then from the table a voice. I was not able to identify the speaker from my angle, and the subsequent record is ambiguous, said something in cartel formal trade lingua that I would translate approximately as, the session record should note that the compact has withdrawn from the chamber. Orville said so noted. He called for the guidance vote. The vote proceeded. The modified rate structure passed 28-4. The Corvith guidance was issued in the gallery. I and the other 10 support staff also stood. We picked up our bags. We did not speak. We walked to the gallery's rear exit down the connecting stairwell, out the eastern annex approach, through the secondary corridor and out of the grand convocation hall. I remember the amber stone under my feet as we crossed the threshold, and then the different surface of the annex corridor, a plain composite material, and the way the lighting changed from the halls, warm amber washed to the cooler blue-white of the functional spaces. I remember thinking, I don't know what just happened. I remember thinking she did. We met the principals in the diplomatic residence main reception room. Ambassador Voss was already there. She was standing by the window again, as she had been the night before, looking at the city. She had a glass of water. She said to the room, leave the green tabbed folders on whatever surface they're sitting on. They don't come home with us. Counselor Prosh said, we left them in the hall. Voss said, yes. He said, on the chairs. She said, yes. He said, what's in them? She said, the record. He looked at her. She did not explain further. She said, book the earliest possible departure that won't look like flight. Day after tomorrow. We'll spend tomorrow doing our scheduled bilaterals as if the session concluded normally. Questions? No questions. She said, good night. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in my bed in the diplomatic residence and stared at the ceiling and tried to reconstruct everything I had watched over the 3 days and put it in an order that made sense. I knew the walk out had been deliberate. I knew the folders had been deliberate. I knew the past address windows had been deliberate. I knew the choice not to respond to the courtesy chair arrangement had been deliberate. I knew all of it was deliberate, and I knew there was an architecture to the deliberateness that I could not fully see, the way you can see part of a structure through a window and understand it is larger than the window shows but can't work out the dimensions. From the fragment, what I knew for certain, we had not been in a session, we had been in a demonstration. and I did not know lying there whether the demonstration had been orals in the cartels or voces or both at once going in opposite directions. In the morning I went downstairs and found the support staff in the residence small common room, and we had breakfast and no one talked about the session. On the table there was a copy of the cartel's commercial press service, a daily summary of convocation proceedings. The lead item was the Corvith guidance. The Earth Compact's walkout was mentioned in the fourth paragraph, described as a procedural withdrawal, no context given. We spent the day doing bilaterals. I was not in the bilaterals themselves. Those were principles only, but I was in the anti-room of the Varath Trade Ministry, while Voss and Ruiz met with two separate Trade Ministry officials in succession, and in the anti-room I sat and kept my notes current and watched the ministry officials' assistants go back and forth, and I noticed that two of them in the course of the afternoon made brief detours past the anti-room, where I sat, in a way that felt less like they were going somewhere and more like they were checking something. They were not looking at me. They were looking at the door behind which Ambassador Voss was conducting business. As usual, the bilaterals ran 2 hours each. At the close of the second one, as Voss and Ruiz emerged into the anti-room with the Trade Ministry official, a mid-level Varath functionary named Savin Orth, and practiced, Orth said to Voss in the slightly over-wrathful manner of a person delivering a line that has been approved by a superior, "We hope the compact found the session productive despite any procedural inconveniences." Voss said entirely. Orth said the Trade Ministry values the compact's ongoing commercial engagement. Voss said, as does the compact. She shook his hand. She walked past me toward the anteroom exit. She caught my eye for half a second, and what I saw in that half second was not satisfaction and not amusement and not contempt. It was the expression of a person who has just heard exactly what they expected to hear, and the expected thing is not good news, but is at least confirmed information, and confirmed information is always worth something. What Orth had communicated in that over-careful language was that the cartel was already trying to take the measure of the damage and hadn't yet made the calculation. Values the compact's ongoing commercial engagement was not a courtesy phrase. It was a probe, a careful inquiry into whether the walkout represented a change in Earth's commercial posture or only a political statement that could be absorbed and moved past. Voss had answered it with as does the compact, which was true and uninformative and gave them nothing to work with. She had been giving the cartel nothing to work with for 9 years. She was good at it by now. We departed. The following morning, the departure was without incident. Orville did not contact the residents before we left. No cartel official contacted the residents before we left. The departure was exactly as quiet as Voss had calibrated it to be, present enough not to look like flight, absent enough to leave no surface for anyone to grab. I filed my session notes on the transit home, and I filed them as a standard observational record, and I went back to my other work. And I did not know for the following 14 months what the green tabbed folders had contained. On the transit, I spent a fair amount of time looking at the observation port and turning the session over in my mind the way you turn a stone you found, inspecting it from angles that don't quite account for its weight. I had by then been in enough diplomatic proceedings to understand the basic grammar of political theater. Who needs the room to see them? Who needs the room to fear them? Who needs the record to show a particular sequence of events? The core of session had been political theater in this sense, but the authorship was not what I expected. I had assumed walking in that the staging was entirely the cartels, the courtesy chairs, the emptied gallery, the reflex you're standing, appropriately formula from Orville. All of that was cartel staging designed to remind our delegation of the shape of the arrangement before a significant vote. What I had not assumed was that our delegation was staging something simultaneously, that the two performances were running in the same room at the same time, aimed at different audiences. The cartel staging was aimed at us. Sit here in these chairs under this placard and know what you are. Our staging, if I was right, that it was staging, was aimed at the cartel's archival infrastructure. Leave these folders here in these specific chairs that the Secretariat will process, and know what you are holding. The symmetry of it was what I kept returning to. The cartel's production was visible, deliberate, designed to be felt in the room on the day. Ours, if it was ours, was invisible, patient, designed to be felt in a report 6 months later. One of them was performing for the other's present moment experience. The other was building something in the other's institutional record. I did not know on the transit whether I was right about any of this. I only knew that the session felt the way certain conversations feel when you realize 3 hours later that you were not the only one who knew what was being said. 14 months later, I was a deputy at HFY with a slightly expanded portfolio, and I was briefed at the appropriate clearance level on what I am about to describe. The Earth Diplomatic Compact had been for 11 years doing exactly what it appeared to be doing, participating as an observer in cartel proceedings, building commercial relationships with cartel member bodies, expanding Earth's freight volume in the core of corridor and in several secondary commercial channels, and accumulating a detailed operational picture of how cartel trade governance actually functioned, as distinct from how it was formally described. It had also been doing something that it had not been describing to the cartel for 9 of those 11 years, in parallel with the observer participation and the commercial expansion. A small team within the Compact's Trade Bureau, reporting directly to Ambassador Voss, not to the Bureau's administrative hierarchy, had been building what they internally called the lattice. The lattice was not on its face extraordinary. It was a set of commercial relationships, long-term supply agreements, volume commitment contracts, preferred rate shipping arrangements, cargo routing protocols, and joint logistics ventures between Earth commercial entities and approximately 43 distinct companies, consortia, and trade partnerships operating within and around cartel space. None of these agreements were secret. They were all registered in the appropriate commercial records. They had all been reviewed at various points by cartel compliance offices and found unremarkable because each one reviewed individually was unremarkable. What the cartel's compliance reviews had not done was map them together. What the Compact Small Laddies team had done over 9 years was build these relationships with a specific and cumulative intent. Each agreement was structured so that in the event Earth terminated it, the counterparty would face a defined and Significant operational disruption, not ruinous. The compact had been careful not to design anything that would look like a weapon from the outside, but meaningful, a volume commitment that, if withdrawn, would leave a consortium under capitalized for a planned expansion, a preferred rate arrangement that, if ended, would require a company to renegotiate 2 other contracts to maintain margins, a logistics protocol that, if would add 3 weeks to a supply chain that served a cartel member body's industrial production schedule. Each disruption alone was a manageable inconvenience. Together across 43 relationships, all terminating simultaneously, the disruptions would cascade, not catastrophically. The compact had again been careful about this, but systemically there would be delays. There would be cost spikes. There would be renegotiations. There would above all be a period of sustained operational friction across significant portion of cartel commercial activity, and this friction would be precisely traceable to the termination of Earth's commercial relationships with cartel-adjacent entities. The lattice was a proof of value. It was a demonstration constructed over 9 years that Earth's commercial presence in and around cartel space was not incidental background volume, but a load-bearing structural element that, removing it, would be felt. The 9 years had not been accidental. I learned in the briefing that the lattice had been conceived in year 2 of Earth's observer status, specifically in the aftermath of the first membership application rejection, when Voss had concluded that the harmonization standards objection was not a technical problem but a political one, and that technical solutions would not resolve political problems. The admission committee was not blocking Earth's membership because Earth's frameworks were out of compliance. It was blocking Earth's membership because the cartel had made a calculation in year 1 that Earth's commercial footprint in cartel-adjacent space was too shallow to justify the governance obligations that full membership carried. The framework's objection was the mechanism. The actual lever was the dependency calculation. Voss had decided in year 2 that the dependency calculation was the only thing worth working on. The lattice team had been 3 people for the first 4 years, then 5, then 7. They worked within the trade bureau's ordinary commercial development function, which meant their activity was indistinguishable from outside from standard commercial relationship building. They were building commercial relationships. Every relationship they built was also at a second level of analysis, a carefully placed load-bearing element in a structure that, when complete, would demonstrate one thing clearly, that Earth's commercial absence from cartel adjacent space would cost more than its presence, that the calculation needed to be run again, and the answer had changed. The elegance of it, and I use that word deliberately because it is the right word, was that the demonstration did not require Earth to do anything aggressive. It required Earth to do what it was going to do anyway: build commercial relationships, grow its corridor volume, expand its presence in adjacent systems. The lattice team simply ensured that this growth was structured in a specific way and documented with a specific thoroughness and packaged for delivery at the specific moment that the cartel's institutional record would receive it. Most usefully, the green tabbed folders that Ambassador Voss had left on the courtesy chairs were the latticed documentation Every agreement, every counterparty, every termination clause, every modeled disruption organized into a single, coherent package, the full laddies, delivered to the grand convocation hall, and left on chairs that the cartel's own archival staff would collect and process into the session record. The folders were not a threat. There was no cover letter. There was no address line. There was no language in them that said, "This is what we will do to you." The cartel's archival staff processing the session record would find 5 identical green tabbed folders on 5 plain courtesy chairs and would open them and would find the documentation inside and would, in the ordinary course of their work, route them to the appropriate analytical office, and the analytical office would read them, and the analytical office would understand what they were reading. I was briefed on this 14 months later. By that time, the cartel's response to what I had thought of until that briefing as a clean and consequential walkout had entered a phase that the galactic commercial press was characterizing as a renegotiation of the Corvith guidance. The press was not wrong exactly, but it was missing the geometry. The cartel had not reopened the Corvith docket because of the walkout. It had reopened the Corvith docket because its analytical office had processed the green tabbed folders and had produced a report, and the report had been routed to the working committee overseeing Corvith corridor governance, and the working committee had read the report, and the working committee had gone very quietly to the oligarch house representatives who ran the cartel's actual decision-making and had told them what the report said, and the oligarch houses had looked at the disruption modeling across 43 commercial relationships and had done their own arithmetic. The arithmetic was not about Earth's corridor freight volume, although that was part of it. It was about the 43 relationships and their counterparties, and those counterparties' relationships with cartel members, and those cartel members' operational dependencies, and the chain of consequences that the compact's modeling had mapped across 4 degrees of commercial separation. The cartel was not looking at a small diplomatic partner's walkout. The cartel was looking at 9 years of deliberate, patient, legally unremarkable commercial architecture that had been built to demonstrate one thing, that asking humanity to leave the table cost more than keeping them at it. It cost more than the courtesy table, not the real table, the courtesy table, the gap, the placard, the plain chairs. That was what needed to be understood. The cartel had believed it was seating them at a remove because it could. Laddie's documentation made clear without a word of argument or complaint that this calculus needed to be re-examined, that the question was not whether Earth deserved a better seat, but whether the cartel could afford to keep the arrangement as it was. The answer, when the arithmetic was complete, was no. The cartel's approach to the Earth Compact in the 14 months following the Corvette session was not gracious. I want to be accurate about this. The cartel did not at any point say, "We were wrong, we apologize, here is what you deserve." What the cartel did was begin a series of technical discussions through its working committee structure about the harmonization standards that had been the basis for declining Earth's membership applications. These technical discussions were substantive, which the previous ones had not been. The standards at issue turned out to be far less intractable than the admission committee had characterized them. An expedited harmonization review was Completed in less than 8 months. Membership application was advanced to the convocation floor. Earth's full standing application was voted on in the session following the expedited review. It passed 24-8. Ambassador Voss was present for the vote. She sat at the table, the real table, an amber stone chair, no courtesy placard, no gap, and when the vote was announced, she did not smile or react visibly. She wrote something in her working notebook. She closed the notebook. She thanked Orville for his management of the docket. She went home. I was not in the room for the vote. By that time, I had been moved to a different posting. I watched the session record afterward. I watched the vote. I watched Voss write in her notebook. I have wondered over the years what she wrote. I asked her once when I had the standing to ask, and she looked at me for a moment and said, in Thai, closed, which was, I understood, the notation a compliance officer makes when a long-running matter has been resolved without further action required. Entry closed. That is one way to tell this story. Here is another. The 6 years after the Corvith session were difficult ones for the Varath cartel. Not catastrophically difficult, I want to be precise, as I said I would be, but structurally difficult in the way that I described at the beginning, the way a weight-bearing element removed from the middle of a building looks fine and then does not. The membership vote brought Earth into full standing, but it did not resolve the operational disruption that had already begun to manifest across the 43 laddies' relationships, because the compact had not at the time of the membership vote terminated those relationships. It had allowed several of them to expire in the ordinary course of their contract terms without renewal, which produced the disruption's first visible effects, the delays, the cost spikes, the renegotiations, and then had renewed the remaining relationships on terms that reflected Earth's new standing rather than its observer status. The renegotiations were extensive. They ran through most of the first 2 years of Earth's full membership, and they were not, I am told, comfortable. The cartel's analytical office had produced a second report once it became clear that the non-renewals were producing their modeled effects, which attempted to project the consequences of a full lattice unwinding. The report was not public, but its conclusions, which reached the oligarch houses through the same quiet channel as the first report, contributed to the cartel's decision to accept Earth's renegotiated relationship terms without a significant counter-argument. You don't argue with someone who is standing in your load-bearing wall and has been polite enough to show you the structural drawings. The cartel came through the renegotiation period intact. Its governance structures remained functioning. Its major commercial operations were sustained. What changed was more subtle and more durable than any of that. What changed was the distribution of standing, not formally. Earth's membership grade was standard, the same as the affiliate blocks, no special provisions, but operationally, commercially, and in the particular grammar of how things get done in rooms where the formal structure and the actual structure are not precisely the same thing. In that grammar, Earth's position had shifted, not to the head of the table, not to any single place that could be pointed to and named, but to a position that was, when someone needed to count the load-bearing elements, counted. Keith Orville retired 4 years after the Corvette session. His retirement was described in the cartel press as voluntary. I have no information suggesting otherwise. He was succeeded by a younger Verath official who had, from all available evidence, studied the Corv session record in some detail. Before taking the posting, Assessor Pyth became over the following decade one of the cartel's most significant internal reform voices, not in a confrontational way but in the sustained, patient, document-up supported way that certain practitioners use when they have correctly identified which direction history is moving and want to be part of moving it rather than correcting for it. After the fact, I followed her work from a distance for a number of years. She was good, she understood, I think, before most of her cartel colleagues did, that the Corvith session had not been an incident, it had been a measurement. Earth had taken the measure of the chamber's tolerance, and the chamber had taken the measure of what Earth had built inside it, and the only question remaining was how quickly the parties could arrive at an arrangement that reflected the actual rather than the formal distribution of weight. The figure I had noticed watching the proceedings on the first day, the Verath delegate in the third chair along the oligarch house side, the one with the expression of anticipation, turned out to be an analyst attached to one of the cartel's founding oligarch houses. His name was Verath Korthan, name that follows the Verath convention of placing the house affiliation first. He had been in the room that day because his house had been briefed at some level on the possibility that the session might produce an unexpected development. He had watched the whole thing with the expression of someone who had been told that a demonstration was scheduled at an unspecified point and was not certain exactly when. I know this because I was introduced to him clear as throat years later at an interplanetary trade conference. We had a conversation over a working dinner that was professionally cordial and revealed in the careful, oblique way of such conversations the shape of several things neither of us had previously had full visibility into. He told me this was not a confidence. I believe he intended me to carry it. That the first report from the cartel's analytical office, the one produced after the green tabbed folders were processed, had been read by his house's senior oligarch within 6 days of the session's close, and that the senior oligarch had looked up from the report and said in Verath a phrase that I will render approximately as, they built the whole thing in front of us and we never looked. I told him I thought that was right. He said, how long did you know? I said I didn't know until 14 months. Afterward, I only knew that she knew what she was doing. He said that distinction is important. I said, yes. He said, most of our analytical staff couldn't tell the difference afterward between the two. I said, most people can't. He looked at me for a moment. He said she was very patient. I said she was. He said 9 years is a long time to be building something no one can see. I said it depends on what you're building it in. He thought about that. We finished dinner. I think about that conversation when I stand in front of the students at the Interplanetary Studies Institute and talk about commercial architecture, which is the course I teach on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the second trimester. I think about it when I tell them the most dangerous instrument in a political negotiation is not the one that makes noise, it is the one that has been doing its work quietly for 9 years and is now sitting on a chair in the middle of a room full of people who did not know it was there. I think about what it must have taken to build the lattice in the open and have it remain invisible, not because it was hidden, it was not hidden, it was registered in commercial records, it passed compliance review, it sat in plain sight, but because no one had thought to look at it whole. 43. Individual relationships, each unremarkable, each reviewed and cleared, each sitting in a different part of the cartel's commercial record system with no obvious connection to the others. The compact had not needed to conceal anything, it had only needed to build carefully enough that the significance of the thing was not visible until you had all of it in front of you at once. That is a different kind of patience than most people mean when they use the word. Most people mean tolerance, the capacity to endure delay or frustration without acting out of turn. What Voss practiced was something closer to structural thinking, the ability to hold a 9-year architecture in mind while conducting the 1,000 individual transactions that constituted its building without letting any single transaction deviate from the design for the sake of a short-term advantage that wasn't worth the cost. She had been offered in those 9 years several moments when a more aggressive posture might have produced a faster, shallower result, a bilateral concession extracted here, a formal complaint filed there, press statement about the membership, delays that would have generated attention and accomplished nothing durable. She had taken none of them. The design was more important than they moments. I think about Ambassador Voss in the gallery window on the night before the session. I think about what it must have taken, not courage exactly, because courage implies risk, and she had done the work to reduce the risk to a calculable quantity, but something like composure maintained over an extraordinary length of time, the patience to build something with a 9-year horizon and not let the impatience of the present moment compromise the architecture of the outcome. She had sat in the courtesy chair below the placard in the plain, pale seat at the gap's end, and she had listened to an entire day and a half of deliberation on a matter directly affecting Earth's commercial operations. And she had passed 2 address windows, and she had said exactly nothing, and she had stood and walked out at precisely the moment that would frame the departure correctly, not a protest, not a tantrum, not a formal objection, not an appeal, but a withdrawal that was also a delivery, because the green tabbed folders were already on the chairs and the archival staff would find them, and the analytical office would read them, and the oligarch houses would do their arithmetic. The cartel's formal record of the Corv session notes in the procedural log that the Earth Compact voluntarily withdrew from the session chamber before the guidance vote. This is accurate. It does note what was left behind, the records. Archists did their jobs correctly. The green tabbed folders were cataloged and filed. The analytical reports that followed are in the cartel's institutional archive, and the archive is accessible to credentialed researchers, and several people have written about what those reports contained. The full picture of the lattice and its 9-year construction has been reconstructed, more or less accurately, in 3 separate academic papers and 1 commercial history of the cartel that I have read. None of them quite get the texture of it, I think, because none of them were there for the courtesy chairs and the placard and the 3 seconds of silence after the door closed. There is a particular kind of decision that only becomes visible after the fact, while it is being made while the 9 years are being spent, while the 43 relationships are being structured, while the compliance reviews are coming back clean, while the address windows are being passed and the chair is being accepted without a word, and the walk is being walked at exactly the right pace. It does not look like a decision. It looks like patience. It looks like a career. It looks like a diplomat doing her work. I know because I watched from the gallery that it was more than that. I know that the expression on Ambassador Voss's face when she stood from that courtesy chair was not the expression of someone who had just decided to do something. It was the expression of someone for whom the deciding had been done a long time ago, and what remained was only the execution, and the execution had gone exactly as designed, and there was nothing more to do in that room. She walked out of the grand convocation hall on Verth Prime, and she got on a ship, and she went home, and she left behind on 5 plain chairs at the far end of a polished amber table under a placard that said courtesy seating, the complete documentation of 9 years of work. The cartel's analysts opened the folders. They read what was inside. They wrote their report. The senior oligarch of the founding house looked up from the report, and they never forgot what they hadn't been looking at. Entry closed.